Well, welcome all back to the Environmental Identities series, number 4. I would like to welcome Dr. Wendy Harcourt and Kante Peng, our new resident, and Marwa. I'm happy to welcome you back to the Jan van Eyck Academie. So good to see you on the screen. Very nice. The Environmental Identities series, this is the 4th in the iteration. Really is reflecting on a larger question that the Jan van Eyck is dealing with, relating to the focus for the next 10 years, which is that the Jan van Eyck Academie is aligning itself with the IPCC and has put climate change forward as a research area. And also very importantly, the questions that come out of that, how does art and design reside in times of crisis and urgency? A question that might not have been that prevalent before the corona crisis, but even the more after the corona crisis has become something that we all think of daily, and also has had an effect on our practice. So it's very nice within that context as well that our curator, Jan van Eyck, Bruno Alves de Almeida, also devised a beautiful series that he will be speaking about more now. So I'll give you the stage and I'll welcome you very much, all of you and all of the participants here in the offline situation and all of the people online. Thank you. By the way, I'm Hisham Khalidi, the director of the Jan van Eyck Academie. I keep forgetting it every time that I speak, but there you got it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hisham. I'll reiterate my name on that note. I'm Bruno Alves de Almeida. I'm the curator of public programs and resident liaison here at the Jan van Eyck Academie. And building up on that introduction from Hisham, first of all, I would like to welcome you all to Feminist Naturecultures, the 4th event of the Environmental Identity series, which is a program that we've been developing that looks at the correlation between self and social identity and the natural environment. We kicked off the series with a conversation with Dr. Susan Clayton, where she shared her expertise in as a social and conservation psychologist, and she shared her expertise on the notion of environmental identity in relation to many different aspects, such as self and group identity, political and ideological affiliations, climate change, social justice and equity, among other topics. The second event of the series, titled National Identity and Environmental Hostility, was kicked off by a week-long online streaming of 2 video works, one from Faiza Hamad Khan and the designer and researcher Hannah Ruhlman, and a second video work by former participants here at the Jan van Eyck, Domenico Mangano and Marieke van Gooy, who were then in conversation with Dr. Bernard Forschner, the editor of the book The Far Right and the Environment. And our conversation revolved around the notions of environmental identity in relation to structures of nationalist and far-right ideologies and policies. Our previous event that happened roughly 1 month ago was a performative event organized by 2 current participants here at the Jan van Eyck, the artists Nina Tervo and Young Yun Sun, and it was titled Dinner in the Forest Garden. And it basically gathered a series of participants around a group of edible sculptures by Nina Tervo, and the event was live streamed using a video setting devised by Young Yun. So today, as the 4th event of the series, we also started with an online screening of 2 videos, one by Kanthy Peng, who joins me here in the couch today, the film Another Awaiting Stone, and a second movie by Marwa Arsanios titled Who is Afraid of Ideology? The videos are still available online for today, so you still have a chance to see them. And this online screening culminates in the public conversation today alongside Professor Dr. Wendy Harcourt. So roughly we'll be using the videos as instigators for the conversation that will revolve around the correlation between gender and natural environment, particularly by looking at female subjectivity and drawing from feminist perspectives. The structure for today's event is quite straightforward. The three speakers will give a short presentation, after which we will have a moment for discussion between the speakers, and later on we'll open to the public on the auditorium and online. So in the meantime, please think of questions. And for those online watching on Zoom and YouTube, you can write the questions on the chat. Later on, my colleague Yasmin Ostendorf will select a few to bring to the discussion. Just don't forget to write your name in case you're not identified in those platforms. Now I would like to introduce the speakers before we kickstart the presentations. So Kanthy Peng, who joins me today, is an artist who works primarily with photography, video, and installation. She received her MFA degree from the Yale School of Art in 2019 and attended the Hague School of Painting and Sculpture in the same year. And as I told you before, she's an artist in residence at the Jan van Eyck Academie in the year 2020, 2021. And she just arrived yesterday. So thank you for doing this in such not short notice, but so freshly arrived. In her film, Another Awaiting Stone, the representative of the local Office for Tourist Administration and his secretary go on a field trip to find a potential touristic site on a barren mountain, an awaiting stone. The stone that they're looking for needs to resemble a gesture of a housewife anticipating her husband to come home. Throughout the search, the secretary reenacts her life as a woman being trapped, gazed at, manipulated, and denied. And Kanthy will be the first one presenting after I finish this introduction of the speakers. The second presentation will come from Marwa Arsanios, who joins us online. And Marwa is an artist, filmmaker, and researcher who reconsiders politics of the mid-20th century from a contemporary perspective, with a particular focus on gender relations, urbanism, and industrialization. She approaches research collaboratively and seeks to work across disciplines. Marwa is also a former participant at the Jan van Eyck, which is always good to remind ourselves of. So welcome back, as Hisham said. The first two parts of her work, Who is Afraid of Ideology, that we're screening right now, explore the lived experience of women in three war-torn places, while unpacking the entanglement between ecology, feminism, gender struggle, nation building, and war. Part one is shot in the mountains of Kurdistan and follows the Kurdish women's autonomous movement. And part two is shot in a cooperative in the Bekaa Valley and near the Syrian border, and in Jinwar, a village in Rojava, northern Syria, built for the exclusive use of women. The film looks at the way these women take care of the land and of themselves, their strategies of self-governance, and the creation and transmission of knowledge. It's also good to say that the third part of the film is now being showcased at the current Berlin Biennial, and it's titled Micro-Resistances. So please have a look at it if you are in or around Berlin. Last but not least, we'll hear from Professor Dr. Wendy Harcourt, who is joining us also online. Professor Dr. Wendy Harcourt is Professor of Gender Diversity and Sustainable Development at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University in The Hague. She has edited 10 books, and her monograph, Body Politics and Development, Critical Debates in Gender and Development, received the 2012 Feminist Women Studies Association Book Prize. She is series editor of both the Palgrave Gender Development and Social Change and the ISS Routledge series on gender, development, and sexuality. She is coordinator of the research group on civic innovation, chair of the ISS Institute Council, as well as coordinator of the EU Marie Slogdowska-Curie Innovative Training Networks, WeGo, which stands for Wellbeing, Ecology, Gender, and Community. For complete bios and more information on the speakers, you can go online. This was the too long but yet short version of their bios. I would like to welcome you all. Thank you so much for making time and for being here with us. And before we start with Kanthy's presentation, I would like to show a small excerpt of Kanthy's film that we've been streaming online. titled Another Waiting Stone. You can still watch it today. But before that, I would like to ask Hamid to play excerpt number 1.
他们衣服颜色和我小学校服一模一样。那会儿我发育的早，怕同学笑话我长得凶，就在里边不穿衣服，看着瘦些。有次上操前，也是这样涌来一群男生，把我包抄在操场中央，噌的窜出来扯开我的外套，然后哄笑的跑开。我感觉被全校人都看光了。您说，我那时候那么受男生欢迎，他们现在还记不记得我？
我不记得你了。他们记得的只是想蜂拥而上的那份冲动。我们这块石头要唤起的也是这份冲动。
可望不可及的那种。
不，要渴望，也要可及啊。那帮人说的对啊，你是个景点，可是爬都爬不上去，还有什么吸引力？
那要爬得上去，不是打扰他旺夫了吗？
旺夫，幌子罢了。我只需要他在那儿立着，既端庄又婀娜。盼啊盼的，早都忘了盼的是谁。而那个男人啊，最好帮助他，成就了这个功德，永远别回来。
多亲人的故事。
While making the project Another Waiting Stone, I didn't focus much on the male characters. The leading male figure, called the man, is symbolic, and his movements and language are somewhat abstract. However, when I recently moved forward to the post-production process, I started to pay more attention to him for the sake of color editing. During the shooting, I didn't give him any instructions except for the script. Therefore, his performance is spontaneous, full of his own interpretation of what was going on. In this talk, I would like to start with my observation of the man. The green sweater the man wears under his jacket is my father's military uniform. I grew up in a military community in Beijing with very little development surrounding it. There was a large sunflower field next to the graveyard, where my little buddies from the military yard and I used to have lots of fun. The area was called Wang Yefen, the Prince Graveyard, so you can imagine the kind of scary ghost stories we grew up listening to. My friend's friend said that he dug out coins from Qing Dynasty, but he never showed them to us. After Beijing successfully bid for the Olympic Games, the city rapidly globalized. The urban circle expanded. Highways and subways replaced the farmlands in the area I lived in. Then, the Olympic Park was completed, and the Olympic Forest Park was developed, where city jewelers and travelers could enjoy the artificial lakes, small hills, and national protected animals. I often jogged with my father in Forest Park. He felt fortunate to live close enough to this means of maintaining health in a big city. When he runs in front of me, he wears his military sports suit. He is allocated similar clothes with different fabrics for different seasons and occasions by the army. When I started planning for this short film, since this project is partially about attraction development, I naturally thought of shooting in the Olympic Forest Park. I soon gave up on this idea because the story needs an unexploited hill. By that time, I hadn't realized it was so hard to find one. There is no lack of strange rocks and sublime mountains in China, but almost all of them have been named and exploited. One can easily find out more than 10 tourist sites, large or small, labeled a waiting stone, across the country. I was literally searching for another awaiting stone. Each awaiting stone has its own version of a folktale. The basic structure is similar. A husband leaves home and never comes back. His wife keeps waiting at home for many years until she becomes a stone, but still waiting. Among these various adaptations, the experience of the husband leaving home usually reflects the social, political, and environmental status of the time, while the waiting wife seems to need no explanation, and one simply needs to appreciate her virtue. Likewise, in the film I made, the woman stands in front of a stone selection for the man to compare their shapes. They seem to have unspoken disciplines, so that without much verbal guidance, the woman integrates herself with the landscape behind her. When we look into a female portrait in nature, it is rarely questioned, why do they appear there in the first place? The female body placed in landscape, and landscape likened to the female body, is almost a matter of fact in representation. Well, it actually reflects quite a bit, doesn't it? Inspired by the waiting stone story, I started to collect other folk tales of the female body transforming into stone in East Asian culture. My favorite one is from Japanese folklorist Sasaki Kizen's Folk Legends from Tono. I read it when I was researching the origin of Japanese folklore culture in Tono in 2018, and I would like to share it with you here. As you go along the road to Nakasai, there is a stone that is the guardian spirit of abundant breast milk, the protector of birth and nurture. There is the story that, for some reason or other, a Buddhist nun was transformed into this stone. I am obsessed with this paragraph because as a folktale, it is ridiculously simple. But to some degree, it suggests a complementary relationship between history and folklore. Imagine how people in the future will learn about things that are happening on this land today. Modern infrastructures replace historical sites. Artificial landscapes replace the natural environment. The man who decides is leading this marathon. Before we realize what is happening, he has already decided on what constitutes developing the future and preserving the past. What is history? The legitimacy of history is hard to contest. But on the contrary, folklore is created and spread among ordinary people and continually changes and evolves. The stories that get told may sound too absurd to put in history, but it is precise because of their absurdity that they escape from being deleted and have the potential of telling the truth of the time. Another waiting stone is therefore a story about another woman becoming a stone, another mountain becoming a scenic spot, and another piece of memory becoming a legend. I'd like to believe that I am creating some sort of new adaptation of this century-old folktale, though it is quite challenging to keep such a belief. During the process of location scouting and film shooting, I see myself gradually turn into that man who decides. I turn into the father. I transported my crew from Beijing to this village in Hubei. I use the camera to judge what is valuable and beautiful. It's the story I decide to tell, the story that needs to be told most urgently. I don't have answers, but I hope one day I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kanthy, for that beautiful presentation. Before we ask questions, I would like to move to Marwa Arsanios' presentation. But before that, and following the tradition with Kanthy, I would like to show a small excerpt of the movie that we've been streaming online, titled "Who is Afraid of Ideology?" And just a disclaimer, and I would like to ask Hamid to play the second excerpt. Just a disclaimer, it's the video, the audio and image are supposed to be mismatched. So it's not a problem with your connection, neither with our technicalities over here. It's part of the movie. So Marwa, you can start presenting after the excerpt, okay?
We are not outside observers of the world, nor are we simply located at particular places in the world. Rather, we are part of the world in its ongoing intra-activity. This is a point Niels Bohr tried to get at in his insistence that our epistemology must take account of the fact that we are a part of that nature we seek to understand. Unfortunately, however, he cuts short important post-humanist implications of this insight in his ultimately humanist understanding of the we. Vicky Kirby eloquently articulates this important post-humanist point. I'm trying to complicate the locatability of human identity as a here and now, an enclosed and finished product, a causal force upon nature, or even as something within nature. I don't want the human to be in nature as if nature is a container. If I say this is nature itself, an expression that usually denotes a prescriptive essentialism, and that's why we avoid it, I've actually animated this itself and even suggested that thinking isn't the other of nature. Nature performs itself differently.
Hello, I just yeah, change my screen to full screen mode and I can start. Thank you, Bruno, Hisham, Anne, and everyone at Jan van Eyck. It's really a pleasure to be back in the auditorium, even virtually. So as Bruno said, I was actually a researcher participant at Jan van Eyck between 2010 2012. So it's a pleasure to be back to Maastricht through Zoom. I would like to talk about two things today. And these are, of course, related, but they are also like two different instances and two different projects that I have worked on in the past 2 years that are connected directly to the films that are online now. Who's Afraid of Ideology, Part 1 and 2. The first project is a convention of women farmers and ecological feminists that I organized when I was invited to the Warsaw Biennial last summer, so June 2019. I proposed to organize a convention for women farmers and ecological feminists, where I thought to bring together women from different groups that are actively trying to have a kind of a to form or to build a kind of a communal way of living together in certain parts of the world, and it's usually done through reappropriation of land and agriculture and different like agricultural strategies, and also to bring together feminists that sort of like have been working in a tradition of ecofeminism, and also invite some lawyers that have been also like working on very specific legalities around food production and food distribution, etc. So most of the women that were in the convention were coming from the Middle East and South America, but there was also some that were coming from Poland, where the convention was taking place, and also other European countries such as Germany. It was important to kind of like use this Warsaw Biennial moment to test for myself first of all, but also to test together with these women the limits of what one can do within this space of art, or within like a art institution such as a biennial. If one can still use these art platform and art institutions, and therefore also art economy, to sort of like bring together and open a space where all these different activists and farmers and ecofeminists can come together. Of course, logistically, this was very complicated, and it wouldn't have been possible without having a kind of institutional support, such as the biennials, because of course there was a lot of like translation involved, a lot of like simultaneous translation involved, a lot of course, like other logistical also issues that had to be dealt with, and of course it needed a kind of support. Why did I want to bring all these women together and all these initiatives together? Before that, since 2017, I have been in contact with these organizations these organizations independently. So I was sort of like in contact with the autonomous women's movement in Kurdistan. Also, I was in contact with different cooperatives in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, and as well as in Mexico, in certain like groups in Mexico City, but also in Oaxaca, and also in Colombia, and south of Colombia, in Tolima, and south of Tolima. I was already in contact with different organizations and groups there myself. And so many of the discourses and the political discourses and rhetoric was very similar. And I was thinking all the time that this is really a front that one can build, actually, almost like a political front that one can build by bringing together all these women from these different places, but also especially because they had such similar struggles, but in completely different territories. And when I say similar struggles, I'm of course like referring to land struggle, and how land struggle is actually dealt with through very specific agricultural strategies, and also very specific feminist discourses. So this was like a very important crossover or intersection between all of these women's struggle. They had very like strong, like a land. It was, I would say, like grounded in land struggle, but also they were very aware of the gender struggle and how these things go hand in hand and they go together. So it was really like a crucial moment when they all met, and we realized that they really were working in similar strategies, techniques, but also how they could enrich each other's rhetorics and discourses also, and horizons and open a certain like horizon for work. For example, the women from Rojava, they were much more ideologized, let's say, or I don't know if this word exists, but they were grounded in a very strong feminist ideology, and it was clear that they were educated in, to speak up in such a language, but did not have, for example, the same kind of like agricultural strategies that have been developed for years in, for example, south of Tolima in Colombia. So this kind of like meeting was very sort of like enriching. And then I started to think about why this can only, I mean, perhaps these kinds of, meetings happen in, I don't know, like NGO situations, or in kind of like or world conventions, or I don't know, like international organizations that would bring, together, that could actually like perform, or like that could do a similar kind of meeting or convention. But why? What is the specificity of having such a thing happening within an art setup, or like an artistic biennial? And what is actually my role as an artist in such a kind of like a why would an artist do or like organize such a setup, or the convention. And in fact, it was very revealing because many of, I mean, in one way it was revealing that, of course, like the layers of discourse and the layers of sort of like, yeah, kind of the sediments and the layers of multidisciplinary, let's say, discourse, and the way that it is still possible, or art, an art institution is still a place for the possibility of the crossover of these different discourses from women that were actually, you know, had the knowledge in like the kind of agricultural knowledge, and between them and the women that had, you know, like legal knowledge, and the other women that had and the other like more theoretical discourse and language. So it became very clear that such a crossover in research can really be like that the space for that can be the art institution. So this was like a sort of a moment where I sort of also for myself understood why I am still, you know, doing such work within an art context. But then there's like so many, of course, questions that come out of this these kinds of meeting, and they are really questions of often like there's a lot of course, like similarities and crossover between, you know, all these different places and geographies and struggles. But at the same time, there's a lot of, you know, differences as well. And the acknowledgement of both, like these differences and these commonalities, is so crucial. So then again, there was like other questions that came out in terms of, for example, why do we need actually this kind of exhibition of knowledge, in the sense that exhibition of knowledge to an audience, for example. Why is this important? Why do we need to have like, I mean, what comes out also of such a gathering within like an art you know, institution is also that you have like all the art audiences, and you have like kind of there comes the question that why actually do we need to make this sort of like knowledge visible to such an audience? Why is this important, and who is it serving, of course? Are we actually, you know, just bringing in these women's knowledge and making them visible? And why would this woman like need that? And so like there was a lot of sort of like let's say interesting contradictions that came out of the convention, and the questions that followed were very much like about you know, like the ethics of labor and the ethics of work when one works with different activists and yeah, like farmers communities, and of course there was also like a political question of where one stands in relation to these struggles. Of course, I mean, I don't have like a clear-cut answer to that, and I would be. It would be a little bit hypocritical if I would say that I am like a partisan, or I am not part of and directly part of any of these movements. I am, of course, like been working with them, and I've been like working also not only in, you know, organizing things, and not only in this convention, or not only doing films, but also there is like other works that is also like a kind of an invisible work. But still, it is a very like a crucial question that needs to be answered for understanding arts and the artist's position in relation to such kind of you know, such kind of practices. So this let's say like a let's call it an interesting contradiction came out of, you know, the convention directly, and of, you know, bringing you know, everyone together. So yeah, so I guess that crucial and essential questions were opened. Also because at different instances since 2017, I have been visiting these women in their own territories, and trying to spend time there, and trying to also like understand the struggle, their struggles. And as I said, it's always kind of like related to questions of land, so reappropriation of land often, and what one does when, you know, this reappropriated land becomes has like a is handed over to the community. So what happens at this moment, what happens on a legal level, but also what happens, you know, what does one do? And one way and one methodology that I figured out of how to understand things was to organize reading groups in the place where that I visit. And to read together certain writings that, you know, the women themselves have written, and to sort of like try to discuss the ideological and political framework and the political paradigm, whether like the feminist or the ecological paradigm of the group and the movement. So, for example, in the case of the Kurdish Autonomous Women's Movement, I went to one of the mountains where there is like a camp, and spent time there with the women, trying to really like dig into writings and readings, and trying to understand focusing, of course, on the feminist and ecological paradigm of the movement. And it was, of course, like this is, in this case, it is an armed struggle. So it is also like a militarized struggle in the sense of of self-defense. Of course, it is not a let's say pacifist struggle. So this is also like important, and for me it was extremely important to understand that in opposition and in also like strong antagonism to pacifist struggles, or like let's say like liberal feminists that preach non-violence in all cases. So it was like also a turning point to sort of like understand this relationship between a militarization and land struggle and feminism. And this is a very, it took some work to sort of like come out of a certain like a feminist liberal frame or like also political frame of mind. And of course, it's such an important friction to start to understand also this relationship of struggle, or this alliance between a group of women and the landscape, let's say, or like the non-human environment that they live in, and try to understand it in the sense of how they kind of like try to sort of practice these ideas. And in practicing such, frame of thought, let's say, there's been a lot of discussions and debates around that, and whether this does not also like again frame women in a kind of like mother nature, kind of like category or paradigm of thought, which is often women are sort of like associated to the natural or to nature, but in the way they are doing it and in the way this is practiced, it has been like quite revealing. How can an idea such as mother nature, such a let's say repressive idea, can actually be shifted around and practiced in a way that is very emancipatory as well. And again, I also wanted to really see and experience how this relationship between ideology and practice is taking place. So that's when I visited the woman-only village in northern Syria, where it's a kind of a commune where actually a lot of these political ideas and the different feminist and also ecological paradigms are practiced. And these, you can see them also, you can see it in the film. I mean, I will not talk a lot about this. But then again, it is also, of course, like another important question came out, and is also a question of how does one position oneself again, but now through the image, and how does one position oneself towards the struggle, towards all these ideologies, towards all these politics, but through image making. And of course, this is like a kind of a, I don't know, maybe like a very old question, but at the same time, it's always renewed in the sense that, well, if one wants to take an aesthetic and political position towards these struggle, can one do that without, being directly involved, or like almost have a position of partisanship towards, these struggles, not only like a sympathetic sort of like relationship, but a true alliance, which is almost like a partisanship, which is like almost, you have to enter everything that the movement sort of like offers, which is not, always what you can as a subject maybe understand, accept, etc. and which is often, of course, like you can criticize it and etc. So I think that all these questions that came out along the way, whether how can one as an artist relate and position oneself in regards to a or maybe I would frame it differently. How can one use their position as an artist or their role as an artist to organize something such as the Convention of the Women Farmers and Ecological Feminists? How can one work and use a certain like art economy to push forward certain politics? On the other hand, another also very important question is this question of how does one position oneself aesthetically and politically within image making and within film production. So the third part of this project that I just finished now was also a visit to south of Tolima. It's in the south of Colombia, and in fact, this is the film, the third part that is shown now at the premiering now at the Berlin Biennial, and in fact, during this visit, and it was right before Corona, actually, the lockdown. And I was intending to go a second time, but I think that this will not happen at the moment. So during the months of February and March, I visited different farmers that I had already met through the convention, that I had already invited to Warsaw Biennial. And so I visited their farms, and in fact they are seed guardians, and they are coming from different indigenous communities. One of them is the Pijao community in south of Colombia, and so I stayed at their farms also, and so this is shows in the third part of the film. It's a different, of course, it's a completely different trajectories, and it is not, part of one movement, but of a community of indigenous community that are organized completely, of course, and differently. It is not an armed struggle as such, but then again, the question of reappropriation of land, the question of caring for the very smallest entity in the world, such as seed, in order to, care for the land, and this relationship between the seed and the land, so the micro and the macro in the struggle for land. So I think that it's another, question emerged then, and it's I think an interesting one after the lockdown, is how can one continue building this front without being able to travel and without being able to meet the communities, because these all these connections and alliances were built on the fact that I could travel, that I could move also myself, and then try to bring people together. So how can one continue this in such a situation now? So that was something I was really thinking about recently. I guess I will stop now and maybe we can talk more during the questions.
Thank you so much, Marwa. Thanks for bringing so many questions. I'll be happy to pick them up in our Q&A, in our conversation afterwards. So now, Wendy, if you're ready, you have the word.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Bruno, and the Van Eyck Academy for inviting me into a conversation where, having listened to Marwa's extraordinarily eloquent discourse, I feel, and listening also to Kanthy and watching the films, I feel I'm somewhat at the margins as a non-artist, but at the same time, there's a lot of resonance in terms of the issues that they're bringing up in very different ways than someone who is an academic at the moment can bring up. I mean, I think there's a lot of resonances, which I'm sure in our conversation will come out. But I think it's pretty brave to have conversations like this across disciplines. So at least I feel brave on my part, I think, because I'm trying to now enter into a quite different realm of speaking about things that you have been showing and engaging with as artists. So if you could stay a bit more patiently with me, that would be great. So I wanted to bring into the conversation the concept of how can we reconnect with the earth in terms of some of the things Marwa has been talking about, and also Kanthy about how do we decenter the human and think about more than human relations as feminists. I'm inspired both by your films and also by particularly indigenous and ecofeminist thinkers have really made me question how you can think about caring for the earth in different ways. And I should say that, yeah, I'm here as an academic, I guess, but I really wear several hats, as we all do. I'm a feminist political ecologist. I'm also somebody that's worked very much in those NGO social movements that Marwa was indicating, meet all over the world to talk about how you transform it through using forums such as the World Social Forum or the UN or whatever. So in that sense, I'm also a feminist activist that's been trying to bring together those issues in different ways than Marwa, but a lot of the things she's talking about, I've also been trying to deal with. And then also, and this is maybe a bit different, I come to this kind of conversation as a white settler Australian who's been living in Australia, in Europe for now over 3 decades. And I'm also going to speak, which I guess we all do, because that's probably why we want to be in this sort of forum, from my very deep sense of concern that something has gone terribly wrong in our lifetimes in terms of how we are not caring for the earth. And I think as artists, as your films show, I think as we try to think about how to care for the earth, we need to pay attention to our emotions and our bodies and our hearts, as well as our minds, and to think about the different sorts of life worlds that we are trying to engage in, and to really stop some of the very negative things that are happening, which COVID is just one example, climate change is another. So I just felt I wanted to mention, because again, I sometimes feel very awkward wearing this professorial hat, that a lot of my knowledge comes from being a feminist activist, beginning from when I was a student, and as somebody who was in Australia joining my feminist collective in all sorts of campaigns to blockade the loggers who are trying to dam the wild Franklin River in Tasmania, going to the heart of South Australian Roxby Downs to prevent mining of uranium, and then into the center of Australia to stop US weapons coming in basically as a military base that weren't used, but were there just sort of lent to by the Australian government. And I think these are the sorts of things I've been aware of and trying to be involved in. But what I actually see now were part of the resistances, which are always going on, that are really challenging the sorts of mainstream, in those cases, Australian policies and environmental policies that we're still having to to defend, to resist. And I think that this sort of need to unmake the neoliberal capitalist policies, a system of power and profit, and the way it's destroyed this sort of web of life. For me, these are things I'm still trying to puzzle out. And listening to Marwa and also Kanthy, I see that we're going to have to find very different ways of getting people to see how to put in place social justice and ecological sustainability. I think that Extinction Rebellion today, for example, in the Netherlands and other climate justice movements are certainly doing this in exciting and interesting ways. So I can't offer, like Marwa is or Kanthy, some sort of beautiful film, I wish, but what I would like to do is maybe, if I could, just share some concepts with you, which are things that I find useful in trying to think about how we can care for the earth. So these concepts, the first one is Earth Others, which is a very beautiful concept, I think, that comes from the late Val Plumwood, who's an Australian ecofeminist, who wrote about ecological and cross-species care. And she basically is referring to the world of animals, plants, and minerals of which we come from. The other concept is caring for country. This is an Indigenous Australian concept that means far more than land and territory or agriculture. And it's really a very different way of understanding how we are linked to the landscape in a very profoundly spiritual way, which I think is some of the things that actually your films point to. And I'm particularly referring here to Irene Watson, who is actually the first Indigenous Australian as a professor of law. She is actually born in the same place and time as myself, very different kinds of disciplines and understandings, but someone who I learn a lot from. And I think is really trying to heal the historical and contemporary rifts in Australian life worlds. And then this concept of life in common, which I think is a very hopeful concept, which comes from feminist political ecology scholar Neera Singh, who also speaks about commoning and asks us to think about the commons as something that humans share with the more than human others. So in a rather academic way, I'm just going to take you through some of those concepts. And I would really love it if you could look at this very beautiful story by Val Plumwood called The Eye of the Crocodile. It's a very haunting story. It tells of how it's also free and available online, which was actually done in her name by her colleagues when she died. They put this online from the Australian National University Press. It's a haunting story that tells about how she survived a crocodile attack. She reflects on how she survived being rolled by this crocodile by thinking about herself in the sort of chain of animality and embodiment, and the idea of her becoming food for this crocodile. And what does that mean in terms of both thinking flesh as a human, but also knowing flesh as a food. And she's, from that story, asks us to consider how we see ourselves in ecological terms, where nature and animals such as the crocodile are part of ethics and culture. There are sentient beings and our kin. And Val Plumwood is a very sophisticated philosopher, but she tells beautiful stories about what Donna Haraway has called nature cultures. So, for example, her cross-species caring for wombats, which are a marsupial native Australian animal that she cared for in the place where she lived. So she invites us, instead of seeing nature, which this would resonate a lot with Australians in particular, as something to be feared and conquered, she rather asks us to see it as part of our ecological selves and our embodied selves, so that we are part of the web of relations, which importantly, we cannot fully know or control. So she tells us that we are part of a differential belonging in the sense of, in this case, the Australian bush. And she's inviting us to reimagine ourselves ecologically as we link with environmentalism and social justice and these connections we have with our earth others. In that sense, she's really challenging our modern technocratic culture, which claims mastery over nature and relies on all these multiple centrisms: anthropocentrism, self-centrism, Eurocentrism, androcentrism. And is a culture that worships economic rationalism and masculinity, and basically denies the agency of other human beings. So I think in this story and in her work, she's asking us to replace developmentalism, rationality, and put there an ethics of respect and responsibility for ourselves and for Earth others. The other thing that Plumwood's work has helped me to rethink then is the importance of how you negotiate life in membership with an ecological community of kindred beings. So to decenter ourselves and put ourselves within a whole range of connections with others, and recognize, okay, our diversity, but the need to reciprocate care and concern for the Earth others. I think this is also something that resonates again with Donna Haraway. I'm referring to Donna Haraway because of the title of our talks, the nature culture. And Donna Haraway herself also writes about species companions and how humanity and Earth others are entangled in, to quote her, a knot of species co-shaping one another in layers of reciprocating complexity all the way down. I think Marwa, actually, your work speaks to that, and also Kanthy, in the way that you capture that sense of the different layers of reciprocity. So the next concept I'd just like to touch on is caring for country. When I lived in Australia, I was this fierce socialist feminist. I was out there saving wild rivers, trying to be an ecologist. But to be honest, I was never fully aware of the violence that European settlement had done, both on nature, but also on indigenous peoples, or if you like, indigenous nature culture. And as I've been going back home, I've been really become painfully aware of the erasure of 10,000s of years of knowledge of indigenous Australians and what they call country. So I found reading and learning and listening about caring for country regenerative and inspiring. And because Marwa also was speaking about land, just to underline that country does not mean land as such or territory as such. It's an integrated, more than human presence that incorporates land, animals, and people, but also non-human beings such as tides, waters, winds, insects, rocks, plants, languages, emotions, songs, and ancestors. So in this understanding, humans are not the only sentient beings that are able to control and create. Indeed, care for country is about multi-species belonging, connection, and affinity. So underscoring these deep notions of country as caring, nourishing, connecting, belonging, spiritually and physically, these are very important things, but at the same time, it doesn't deny the violence and the need for racial and social and ecological justice that I think Australians are trying to come to terms with, in a way, trying to link human and more than human relations and responsibilities. The picture that you have there is in late 2019, early 2020, as huge amounts of Australia were on fire, like they are now in California, where something like 3 billion animals died. And this is an example of Indigenous Australians knowing how to actually deal with fires, which white settler Australians did not. So I think in these sorts of, when we talk about caring for country, we also have to recognize and interrogate this Eurocentrism and whiteness, patriarchal privilege, as also something that has to be unpacked. And we have to consider life worlds very differently. If I could just quote Elaine Watson, the professor of law, Indigenous Australian that I mentioned earlier. We need to listen to the natural world constantly. Now, how it is changing, howling, raining, and drying up. We need to continually monitor dangerous extractive industries which might damage our natural ecosystems. First Nations have never stopped watching and acting. The non-Indigenous world needs to learn how to reciprocate and share the responsibility we have to the natural world. Perhaps it begins with some deep listening to the Indigenous world. So the last concept I wanted to mention to you here as a contribution to our conversation is life in common. Now, here we are, at least I'm sitting in the Netherlands. I don't know where the rest of you are. And we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're having to communicate online, and we're missing very valuable embodied connections. So it must seem very strange for me to evoke learning about Earth Others, country, and caring for the Earth from an Australian nature culture very far away. So for me, this is where the concept of life in common is important. We are connected in a web of relations that includes Indigenous knowledges, as much as Eurocentric notions of capitalism and sustainable development. And we are connected through these digital commons. So the term life in common draws attention to this web of relations and to how our self and our subjectivities are collectively built through these material, but also emotional connections and shared possibilities and imaginations. I think probably saying that to artists is not necessary, but I think imaginations are very important and the ideas of possibilities. So for me, this pandemic has shown a multitude of transformative alternatives, the new ways of acting, which are emerging from the violence of colonial wounds, which I've just spoken about, broken industrial contexts, which is climate change or climate destruction, and in fact, environmental destruction. And I think the virus has made visible deep economic, social, and racial inequalities. But at the same time, it's also shown connections. So that in communities across the world, we see a myriad of everyday practices of care with people providing food, shelter, and solidarity that are building a positive web of relations. We can probably discuss that, but I'd like to end on that sort of hopeful note. So just to say, so to our peril, but I think also to our joy, we live in a shared commons, and in the sense of caring for the earth is important because those deep connections and relations amongst humans and more than humans give us hope. So I think what we're observing right now is how connected we really are as the virus moves among us. And we have to learn how to care for ourselves and others. And this includes the more than human others who are embodied and embedded in our one earth. And we need that for our multi-species survival. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you so much, Kanthy, and also Marwa, for your amazing contributions and for the time in putting them together. Maybe we can open now the window, the curtains, and get a bit of fresh light and fresh air. Now I'd like to create a moment for discussion among the speakers and with me to also give you some breathing space. Allow me to kickstart with the questions. And then in the meantime, the people online and also in the auditorium can start thinking of some questions or comments, and later on we can address them too. But I'm really fascinated by the connections that your presentations have, particularly also in relation to what I had prepared to ask you. So I'd like to bring to the table something that Wendy wrote on the text, The Slips and Slides of Trying to Live Feminist Political Ecology. In the book, Practicing Feminist Political Ecologies, Moving Beyond the Green Economy, that Wendy Harcourt edited alongside Ingrid Nelson, that I think it speaks to many of the points you all raised in your presentations. So Wendy, allow me to quote you. And I quote, "There is a real awkwardness in writing and speaking about others, even if there is, alongside the writing, the doing, the activism, and engagement. There are frictions about who writes about what, in what language, and who benefits. Do you stay quiet and on the sidelines, or do you keep writing, positioning yourself as an ally, acknowledging tensions and the messiness of it all? Privilege can mean not knowing and letting go, respecting the space for others to know." I think in all of your presentations, you lay bare the contradictions of doing the work that you're doing, and the contradictions of being in that position of somehow dealing with the slips and slides, as mentioned by Wendy in the excerpt that I just read, of trying to convey the complexity of these women lived relations and embodied and situated knowledge through your work, either it being art making or academic research, filmmaking, or institutional organization. I wanted to insist on that, on these problems, let's say, productive problems. I'm curious to know how you deal with this, and I'm quoting Wendy again, tensions and the messiness of it all, and also with the privilege of having access to these knowledges in your situated work, like Marwa's and Kanthy's work, but also Wendy's research. And then to add a second layer, or a sub-question to this main question, or to this request for you to elaborate a bit more on these tensions and this messiness. I'm particularly interested in how this messiness reflects in actual operations of the work, either it being film, photography, art making, text. Marwa, I would like particularly you to talk about this film and the excerpt that we just saw, the mismatch between audio and image. And if we watch the movie, you also see that you lay bare a little bit of what would be considered backstage, for instance. And for instance, Kanthy, in your presentation, you mentioned that in the process of making the film, you started feeling yourself as the male gaze and the father figure looking at the staff, or at the even at the female figure that you were working with, or the actress that you're working with. So yeah, I hope you accept my invitation to linger on a little bit more in these questions, and I give you the choice to whoever wants to start first. Please go ahead. Or maybe I should choose someone. I'll start with Wendy then, because I was quoting you, so maybe it would be good to hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having read and then quote me. That's a kind of nice thing to happen. Yeah, I think for me, what I'm struggling with right now is whiteness and privilege of whiteness, in terms of trying to, the impossibility of me to understand Indigenous work or anybody's real emotions and concerns. So I struggle a lot with that in terms of my own ethical positionality, and also in terms of being a professor with, I have a large project funded by the EU, as you mentioned, with people, PhDs who are working in communities and doing that work. And that is one of the huge questions that we all have, similar to Marwa. How do you use this? Are you using these people, or are you providing something, knowledge which is useful to make change? So I think these are big questions. That's a very practical one. And then also the racial differences, particularly the colonial differences, are very strong. I've spoken to the Australian differences, but I think that's similar to the big question that we're concerned about, which is how do you bring voice to the margins without exploiting or extracting or ethically undoing what people are doing? I'm sure Marwa could add more on that. And then just secondly, if I could add, the neoliberal academic industry spends an awful lot of time trying to make sure that you fit into particular boxes and particular ways of writing. And that's a huge struggle of mine as well, how to write from your emotions, from the heart, from what you're really concerned about within the academic gaze, which tends to be very much rigid. I sort of hesitate to say patriarchal, but that is how I think about it. And how to write with care and longing without being ridiculed, that you're not empirically grounded or know all the different theories. This is something that I'm really having to deal with. How do you communicate with sincerity and accountability to others if you don't talk about the problems of doing it, the messiness of it all? I've just tried very hard to get an academic paper accepted, and they keep throwing this back at me. You can't tell these stories in this way for different reasons. So I think there's a lot of, and that's not to say I've published lots of things, but when I try to write in a different way, it's very different. It's hard to be accepted in the academic mode. So you mentioned that. I think that maybe I don't know where art academies fit, but I guess there's also an academic discourse that people follow there as well. So those are my responses.
Do you want to pick up on that, Marwa? And we go backwards in the presentations sequence.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Wendy, for a great presentation and talk. Well, thanks, Bruno, also for the question. I think that for me, it was really important throughout the process of the filmmaking, making the film. It was very important to open up and show the means of productions, of the production of the film itself, and how an interview actually is done, and how and what setup is an interview done. And for example, how we cut also when we are editing. So, for example, we were doing an interview, and one of the women asked if she should say it otherwise, and we told her, no, we can cut it, we can manipulate all that. So all of these things are very important to you know, become central to the film and to the, you know, the narrative of the film. And so it's not the film does not become about you know, the portraying the women themselves, but it's also about you know, like their movement, the ideology, their very interesting thought and paradigm of thinking, but it's also about how do you actually how do you actually make a film in this situation. So it is really about that as well, not in the sense that it becomes like very self-reflexive about the artist, blah blah blah, and I mean, this is also maybe not so important, but I think it's important to keep the backstage you know, visible as well. So whatever is called backstage and whatever we usually want to hide in the, you know, like or cut out in the case of the film. So I think that this is a very very important, and I never felt in any moment that I was actually talking on the behalf of someone, or that I was making a film about a group of people, or that I was actually writing about something. The whole way through, I was actually learning about something, and learning about a certain actually feminist politics that I was inclined towards, and that I was, you know, like very like attracted by. So I think that this also, like positioning oneself in this learning process was very important. That I am not in, you know, a place where I am actually portraying something or making like a very fixed image about, but it's a place of learning. And in fact, I also want to add one more thing, is that it's important also to not forget the political level, in the sense that I actually would ally myself politically with this movement. And in that sense, that is what I am interested in. All the other ethical questions are very important, but they come hand in hand with this political position as well. So it's not that I will let go of, a certain like political position because there is like a moral high ground that I want to stand on. I do not mind this moral high ground. I don't want actually to stand on a moral high ground. I want to be able to, have a political and ethical position that is not unmistakable, but that is actually relevant at some moment. And it might also fall apart and change, but at a certain moment, this was the most relevant and the best thing that I could do. So I want to be in this kind of like a position, and that is, I think, for me more important, than being right or on a kind of like a moral high ground or something like that. Yeah.
I just want to continue upon what Marwa mentioned about the decision making during the filmmaking process, and I think that's a lot of. I definitely think a lot about what you mentioned about like this question of seeing and being seen, and my position and the dynamic between me and the person I'm shooting a lot in the film. And I coming from a photography background where like for lots of time I have to think about like why am I taking this photograph, or like why am I positioning her this way, or like who am I influenced by, things like that. And for people who knows me more, they would like looking at my photograph and would say like, oh, this definitely show your desire to her and she's your goddess, blah, blah, blah. And I think, oh, that's offensive, but then it kind of makes sense because apparently there is this relationship and dynamic. So I think I'm trying to, in this film, I'm trying to kind of continue this question in my mind to put, continue it in the film, like some of the shots that I made, because lots of shots are very still. I still consider this film as a photographic work. And I'm trying to like make stills that are very still, and you can, especially those shots with that woman performing for the audience, for the man and for the audience, like kind of forcing you to also experience this manipulation of her and controlling of her. And I think that is something that I'm trying to use the visual language to hint upon. And yeah, also like the clip that you showed is actually the only short clip in the whole film that have conversation, have dialogues. But I think like this is something I'm interested in, like a more direct way of storytelling versus photography. Because I also think about this story is like a folktale, and the folktale is supposed to be like straightforward, and everyone should be able to understand the story but have their own interpretation. So I think this is like a better language in this project.
I was also really struck by that brief moment when the female figure refuses to follow one of the orders of the men, but then succumbs to his wishes after. And we discussed this before. So I'm also interested, and I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about the storytelling part or the narrative part. How was it creating that narrative, and why you had the opportunity there to turn the woman into a hero and kind of disrupt the normal folklores that put the woman in the traditional, in a passive place, but yet again, there's no hero there. So could you elaborate a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the shot that you mentioned is the moment when this man is asking the woman to turn her face back, so people don't have to see her face, but she insisted in showing her face, and she insisted for like a few seconds, and eventually she gave up and turned away. I think, yeah, that's definitely the significant moment in the film that I want to focus. And I think for me, it's like I'm making a new version of this folktale, and it is a tragic story from a woman's perspective. I'm not making a very appealing, appealing world that suddenly she becomes a hero and fight back or something. That would be another work. But I am more interested in this like nuanced resistance, but not strong enough, and like the resilience of it. And I think that's come from my personal experience and the anger behind it. I think that for me is more worth telling. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of other questions, but I really want to give space and time to your questions. Okay, I'll exercise my power of mediator again. And I know that Wendy has a couple of questions that she wanted to ask both Marwa and Kanthy, so we can start there.
Okay. Actually, Kanthy, this is following a bit what you just said, because I found your film just as someone watching it very beautiful. And it seemed sort of like a modern fairy tale, because she was always looking to the man, but then looking away. There was a lot of, as you say, nuanced and contested idea of what his gaze was doing to her and how he was manipulating her in a way. But at the end, and this is really just two parts of it, I was really disturbed by the end, because I wasn't sure what happened. I mean, because I know in the fairy story, the woman is turned into stone. So I felt that at the end, she had also been turned into stone because of the last scene. Maybe not what you meant, but that's how I felt it. And he was with a mop sort of finishing it off or something. That's how I felt. And it was actually, she was, if that was the case, I felt like she was transformed into nature. So that was a bit, for me, that was actually quite violent feeling. It sort of contradicted some of the quiet beauty that you captured. So I just wanted to ask you, well, in fact, I think you've answered it already. Were you denying women's agency in that sense, or maybe you were trying to play with it? I mean, was there some hope there? I felt like I finished not being very hopeful at all, but there were moments where there was some hope. So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit in terms of both the fairy story, that why you took that fairy story, and whether by you reinterpreting it, you're changing it in some way. Yeah, and you've now said it's also about you yourself and your control and agency as a woman artist doing the film making. But maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more how, if there was any hope there.
Yes. Thank you for the question. I think, I don't know if there's hope there, and I don't know if I'm denying or like giving hope in this work, but I think what I'm doing is that as I said, I'm making a new adaptation of this tragic story. And I think the agency of the work, if there is that like I'm telling, the version that I'm telling is something, it's a story that's not supposed to be told. It's not it's not to freeze the women's virtue or anything. It's not like past, because in past versions, it's always like, oh, this woman is so great that she waited her husband for so long. But in this one, it's apparently it's a violence. But there's no way that you can freeze this virtue anymore. It's just really disturbing to see. And I think that's something that I'm trying to make. And yeah, no, it's not a beautiful story. It is in a beautiful scene, but it is violence. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It answers it really well, thank you. And it confirms what I saw in it, but yeah, I would like there to be some hope too, but fine.
Do you want to jump to Marwa's questions already, or should we give it a bit more time also for other questions that might come? Hisham is saying that there is hope in the film. Do you want to speak to the microphone and add something?
I mean, I'm from a Moroccan family, so I know the kind of patriarchal situation that you're showing. My mom always resisted and did not resist at the same time. She did both. And within that, there is resistance because she survived and we grew up, and there were many things that she won, in fact, by having this position of resisting and not resisting. You see, so I think there's hope in that. There's this flexibility, this resilience that is in there. That's what I'm thinking, at least. So I don't see someone that is lost, or especially when you come from a Chinese culture or from a Moroccan culture or from a, I think this may be what you're speaking of, Wendy, the gaze, let's say, the differences in gazes. Yeah. Yeah. And I just wanted to point out was something that I felt that you can't speak of the patriarchy, and the films of Marwa that I've seen actually move beyond the patriarchy because the women are free. And Wendy, you're somewhere in between. I thought that was really interesting to see. You're deliberating and thinking of this movement from the patriarchy to the free, or to where the position of women, or let's say position of us as human beings, is a free position, away from the patriarchy. Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on that, but I saw these relationships there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisham. Yes, yes, that's definitely like different layers that the movies and the speakers bring to. And knowing that the Jan van Eyck Academie has this focused 10-year trajectory that aligns itself with the IPCC in terms of the goal of staying below the 1.5 degrees global warming, I would like to just shift a little bit the conversation and talk about climate change and the relation between, if any, women in climate change. We know that the consequences of climate change will not be evenly distributed, and some parts of the population will be most affected and first affected by these consequences. And women are particularly affected by these because they belong to the percentage of largest percentage of poor population. And let me read my notes. They also face gender inequalities, such as lack of access to resource, limited participation in decision-making process, and so on and so forth. So I would like to understand, and maybe the question is more directed to Wendy, but Marwa, I think with the Convention of Women Farmers, you also tackled with many of these questions and issues. I would like to understand, what does climate justice and restorative justice, and by restorative justice, I mean the process of building a new world alongside the victims, or thinking of these new possibilities of coexisting with the centrality of the victim in the process. So what does climate justice and restorative justice entail from either a feminist political ecology perspective or ecofeminist perspective? I'd like to understand more of that. I always throw the ball to Wendy. So Wendy, please go first.
I can do that, but I'm sure Marwa will come in. So I'll be very brief so Marwa can jump in. Because I think it's evident in what she said and in her film that it's really about learning from the ground up, like from these different ways of what was just said, going beyond patriarchy and creating these different communities, something that is existing alongside capitalism and patriarchy, in fact, but is still existing, so that you don't see capitalism as all embracing or patriarchy as all embracing, but there are cracks and possibilities and things that are flourishing that are there. So I think that those are very important sources, indeed, what Marwa has pointed to, which enables us to understand how we can shift and change within what we're doing. So it's not so much the grand theory, but I think it's learning from how those communities are relating differently, how they're caring differently for each other and for the land. I really like the way Marwa is talking often about the soil, the rain, all these images are very important. So for me, it's listening and learning and then changing the ways in which we understand what I'm calling different life worlds with Earth others and caring communities. And I think they exist everywhere. There's resistances everywhere. It's a matter of those connections. And I don't know, I think, Marwa, I would be more positive that we can keep connecting despite the world we're living in right now, precisely through your sorts of films, because that adds to ways to connect and understand, right? And these crazy Zoom land meetings, I think we're going to have to learn to do those connections. Use what we can to do it. So, I don't know, Marwa, maybe you could elaborate, because you really had a lot to say, the stories that you're telling.
Yeah, well, I think, as you said, actually, that these things are already happening, and something already is falling apart, and a lot of different, kind of ways of living and ways of connecting to the land and to the earth are already, settling, and they are already there. It is still very small. This is, I guess, the problem at the moment. It's like pockets, so like different pockets in different places. But also something important that, for example, it's something that comes to mind also now. I'm originally from Beirut, and I have, haven't lived there for the past 4 years, but that's still somehow considered my hometown. And after the economic collapse that started last fall, so many different initiatives have come together to sort of like start also using a common plot of land to, for example, grow their crops and share them, and different like agricultural initiative. But this is always connected with political movements, I think. This is very important, that it does not become like this just, individualized kind of drive where it's only for me and for my family, or for me and for my small community, but it is more connected with I wouldn't say like a very wide long-term vision, but at least a kind of a political drive for a different social contract, or like a different social, like a different sociality. And of course, also, if I take the example of Beirut and Lebanon, it's since the 90s and after the civil war, and like at the beginning of the reconstruction of the country in the 90s, post-civil war, there was like a economical bulldozer, if we can call it like this, that came in and decided to rebuild the country in different, cooperative and not cooperative ways. And this has actually formed a sociality that is built on very like whatever, like a new lifestyle and consumer, extensive consume, how do you say that, like consumption lifestyle, or lifestyle that is built on consumption, etc. I think that this at the moment and after the crisis has collapsed. And we see that, in fact, with this collapse, a completely different solidarity has immediately been built. I'm not saying that there needs to be like a crisis and collapse and people lose their jobs and their homes and it becomes like you know, like implosions and, you know, like explosions and dramatic situations for the new to emerge. But in a sense that the new can only emerge from a sort of a defeat. And a defeat can only, you know, come from a kind of a sort of a collapse of this system. But I think that this comes hand in hand. It's not like we wait for something to collapse to build. I think it is actually while we are building, something is collapsing, and while something is collapsing, we are building. So this kind of movement is already happening, I think, since a while. It's just, yeah, the scale and how to reinforce it is the question. And of course, I mean, ultimately, you know, we do want to topple down patriarchy, but and this is what we will do. But at the same time, I think that we do not want to replace it by sort of like a neoliberal kind, you know, slick, you know, I don't know, system that gives a kind of a you know, like, I don't know, some fake emancipation to women or some kind of like. So this is also like an important struggle at the same time. So yeah, I don't know if this makes sense.
Any questions from the auditorium to add up? Yasmin, please. Can you tell your name before you ask the question, please?
My name is Jasmine. The question kind of builds on what you've just been talking about, Marwa. What I understand from the film is you've been visiting all of these communities, and I was wondering to which extent kind of their knowledge is transferable, because you've been in very different parts of the world, but also to which extent it can be a continued exchange, not per se just in the kind of COVID context, but also without continuously pulling it, or if there is some systems that you imagine where it comes kind of a self-sustainable form of exchange. Thanks.
Yeah, well, we have been thinking together a lot about a way to put together some kind of a structure where all the women that have already met, for example, from departing from the Convention of Women Farmers, would actually not meet again only, or continue this kind of like exchange, because this continues between, you know, people, like individuals, or but in a more like a yeah, like wider sort of exchange that could you know, continue towards something. I mean, I don't know what it is, but continue at least towards a kind of a on the long run. And we have been like thinking about it together with 4 different organizations, one in Colombia, and in the other one in Mexico, and in Kurdistan, and in Lebanon. And in fact, we had some ideas, but it's not very elaborate yet. I tried to do another meeting, but through, again, like another biennial, and decided to do like a closed meeting, a workshop. And this was really nice to meet again, but I think there needs to be another platform that is not only through the arts to kind of like think about a structure that would be more like a sustainable on the long run, and where I could also like pull out and don't have to be there organizing. And but we haven't really found a way yet. And to the question of if these practices, to what extent they are transferable, and in a way, I don't think, I mean, of course, when the women met, it was like, they had a lot of knowledge that was a common knowledge also. So they knew a lot of things, although they are coming from completely different geographies, but they had like a very common, a lot of like common knowledges, let's say, or some very similar knowledges and approaches to things. I think, I mean, I don't know, I think it is, and it is not at the same time. You cannot really like transfer a practice. You can learn from a practice and then do something with it. It's not possible to transfer something or translate something from one place to the other, but probably translate would be more possible than transferring. And I think what you can do is really, yeah, like learn and see how such a thing would work in your context. I think that most importantly, what also can be learned is ways of thinking and ways of thinking about and ways of thinking about relations with non-human or the ecology and the environment. I think this is this was like a quite let's say mind shifting when we met. I think that was like at the core of it. But I think also learning from each other, and you know, yeah, I think this was also one important thing.
Could I come in? Would that
Yes,
be okay? Because there's two things I want to say. One is that I think there's some dangers, no, of kind of building into something too big. And I've sort of, I feel like I lived that, because being part of the feminist movement in the 80s and thinking that we could go to the state and to the UN level, and then seeing a lot of those ideas being co-opted and then turned into mainstreaming gender and all this NGO stuff. I mean, when I was, you know, at university, the word NGO didn't exist. And now it's, you know, kind of the way a lot of people, consultancies, etc., through NGOs. I mean, it's kind of a crazy world where a lot of these ideas got co-opted. So one thing is the danger of getting too big. And then also there are alternatives where people are trying to not do that, but then they're too small. So I think there is a problem there. So one thing that I just wanted to mention is that here in the Netherlands, we're part of a degrowth movement, which is this anti-consumer movement, and trying to think about ecology and also think about feminism and also think about art. So that's one reason why I was excited to be invited here, because I was very interested to see how art is also a place from which to speak, as a political place from which to speak. And I think that's very exciting. And we're planning a meeting in August where we invite art and artists to speak with activists and academics on an alternative form of economy and an alternative way of thinking about ecologies, etc. So I think these are the conversations which are also very productive. And from my mind, kind of new for activists who didn't see, I mean, activists as in these political activists who saw, which kind of extracted art as a sort of representation of whatever it is they wanted to say. And now I'm seeing art as having real space and a way of thinking which goes deeper than the politics or the sort of social analysis or whatever. So I think that's a very interesting moment. And I think that is helped by these sorts of forum that we're having now, but also, yeah, I think we have to fight for that, because you worry that those are the things that are going to disappear when people are thinking, oh, there's no money, oh, let's take it from the arts immediately, or humanities or whatever. Anyway, probably I don't need to say that to this audience, but for me, it would be great to continue these conversations, because they're quite different in format and ways of thinking than your typical political kind of fora. So it's very nice to see.
Thank you. I'm very happy to hear that, because that's exactly the kind of attempt that we're making here through this public program, but also how it reverberates in institutional structures too, how we can think of structure throughout the 10 years, but I think also the 10 years, and Hisham is there, he can add on to it. 10 years is also a motto that what is actually stating is something, pointing to something more sustainable, to something more long-term. It's actually planting the seeds for something else to happen. And there's also a question, as Marwa was referring to in her presentation, about aesthetics and the format of making these things. And with institutional infrastructures, the aesthetics and the formats of making these things, and the voices, literally, and both literally and metaphorically, that we include in these discussions are also part of it. So I would love to end this session on that note, but I will give the audience here or online one more opportunity to ask something else. But if there's nothing on the table, or if you need more time, it's also understandable. And Wendy just gave us the perfect... yes, of course. We have one more question from Huzbe.
Thank you so much for the great conversations today. Having watched the films and listening to today's conversation, it brings to mind the brilliant work of Rob Nixon, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And Nixon, being from the background of literature and storytelling, he argues in the book that whenever there is an impending disaster or a disaster that is unimaginable at scales that has already happened, there is the role of the storyteller in order to captivate a public's mind, in order to communicate the scales of such a disaster. And the storyteller, obviously, in my opinion, at least, even the most literal story has a good metaphor at its heart. So I'd be very curious to hear maybe kind of a conversation between you about the role of metaphor within this feminist political ecology framework.
The name of the book again?
Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor by Rob Nixon. So just the role of metaphor. It's a bit of an open-ended question, but if there's time, we can converse about that.
Do you want to pick someone who will answer it first? We've understood
sure.
that the dynamics
I would love to hear from Kanthy, because her film really initially brought this idea to my mind, the idea of the patient. In Iranian culture, we have a patient stone, and here we have the patient stone, and here the role of the stone is quite metaphorical in its approach. So I'd be very curious to hear about your take on the role of metaphor within the context of feminist political ecology work.
Yes.
Sit here.
Okay. I think I'm not sure if I fully understand your question, but this idea of the metaphor, I think a lot about that. Firstly, because of the censorship and I think the folklore culture is a very powerful. As I mentioned, I think it's a very powerful method to be spread without being deleted or being altered, or it's very freely can be altered by anyone. So that is very free, and therefore there is a lot of room for the different people telling stories, and it's not just from upside down, like the one person decides how to write about these stories. So I don't know, like I'm interested in folk tales because of that. And I definitely see there's like during my research, I saw like lots of similar folk tales in different places in different period of times. And usually after nature disasters, like when I went to Tono in Japan, I was doing a research on this folklore series, and later on I realized that area is like the tsunami disaster often happened every 100 years, and a lot of disasters, and that's why there is like the people's attitude towards the nature, especially towards like mountain or the ocean, keeps shifting, and it reflects in the stories, in these folktales, and in these roles of women. Sometimes they're like really scary women, they're like monsters in the mountains. But sometimes when, I don't know, maybe the situation gets better, or like right after the disaster, they become these nurturing characters. Like the mountain becomes a place that for people to nurture and to like become healthy. So I think there's also lots there to be discovered. So yeah.
It's really interesting. The place sort of becomes a placeholder in terms of like its metaphorical value as well.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I would love to, like, if I can, like, there is a clear timeline for me to follow, like, so that I can see, like, the development of different period where people's perception and attitude changes in relation to the folktales changes. But I haven't found, like, much about that, yeah.
Could I add to that, because we just got an online question from Gary, which is maybe related. He's asking you, Kanthy, to talk a little bit about the relation of the female body gestures and the landscape in the film.
So the gestures in this film, if you saw, is like she's starting by dancing, like dancing and positioning in front of different stones. The dance that she was dancing was referring to another traditional folktale in China, where this woman's husband died because of the slavery, who is building this Great Wall of China. And so she kept crying and crying and crying until one day her tears become this physical force and break down the Great Wall. So the dance that she was dancing in the film, like those gestures, were actually referring to that story. But I guess that's always the struggle of like, I wouldn't be able to tell so much in the work itself of these references. But yeah.
And I'm curious to hear from Wendy, what's the place of metaphors, as Roosbe asked, in feminist political ecology?
Well, I think this is where perhaps we're coming from different traditions of what does metaphor mean. But I was immediately thinking of the fear of metaphor in a way, because people are always interpreting it into, let's say, a scientific way of inquiring about something. So, for example, Marwa refers to ecofeminism, and feminist spiritual ecology spent a lot of time explaining why they're not ecofeminists, because the Earth Mother and the ways in which women were essentialized, etc. And so in the sense, woman itself, it becomes a metaphor also that has to be taken apart, so that you don't speak of woman, capital W, but you speak of diversities and differences. So I think at least in sort of feminist spiritual ecology in the academic sense, there's always trying to go below metaphor and to take apart everything and to put it into context, which can get highly theorize to the point where it loses ground, I think. So it's an ambiguous, I think, and difficult thing, because then you have to read it with a certain language knowledge, right? You have to have read many texts to understand what these things mean. So that's in itself very metaphorical, I think, and not particularly helpful sometimes. So for me, that's a bit what I was saying. I think academe can obfuscate in ways to sort of prove itself to itself and lose a sight of the politics that Marwa mentions, but also I think in its own right to say you're feminist is in itself also trying to indicate the politics of it. So for me, it's a very important question, but answered very differently. I think, though, it's a sort of question of language. And I'm trying to rediscover in myself also the importance of, the Earth Mother, or these images, or something that is also holding these things together and not keep trying to take it apart. So that's why I deliberately talk about care for the earth, because this is like anathema to an academic audience. You would never, I mean, academic speech is not about this, right? You would be defining it in many ways. You'd be talking about all the different sorts of care and what context, etc. So it's a very interesting question, and something that I think I learned a lot from listening to and watching and art, and how they deal with these things, how you deal with these things.
Thank you so much. I'm really aware of your time and of our time, and of the difficulty, which is to stare at a computer screen for 2 hours in a row. But it feels like this conversation wants a part 2, like Marwa's movies. But let's see, maybe that happens in another context. It would be a pleasure. Thank you so much for your presence here, all Marwa, Kanthy, and Wendy. It was absolutely delightful. Thank you so much for everyone's presence here in physicality and online. And thank you for the team of the Jan van Eyck that made this possible, that are either here or backstage. And I would like to invite you for the 5th upcoming event of the Environmental Identities series, which will revolve around the work of 2 of our current participants. Husbeh just asked a question. We'll show a film by Husbeh Hakbari and Felix Kalmensen from the duo Peshvak, the movie Weak Enough to Hear, A Delusion 6 Acts. And we'll also explore the ongoing project of Savage Boiras, sorry, that's her name, was difficult of spelling, called Invasive Species. So the discussion will continue, and I would like to invite you all to be a part of it, both the speakers and the online audience. And that's it. Thank you so much, Wendy, Marwa, and Kanthy again. It was great. And see you next time. Bye-bye. Bye, Marwa. Thank you.